My guest today is Dr. Christian Brady, Anglican priest and Dean of the Honors College at the University of Kentucky. We discuss his work on the Jewish Targums and how he understands God's presence in the midst of great loss. So welcome, thrilled you're here.
Happy to be here, it's a pleasure.
It's good. Well, one of the questions I always like to ask my guests are, what was your first car?
My first car was a 1978 Honda Civic CC 1500, which I had about 9 months before I blew the head gasket on the motor. I think my parents paid about $1,100 for it.
Okay, so not
less.
new. You didn't get a new
No,
Honda, right?
no. It was in 1984, I think, when we got it, which it felt older than now I realize. Now I realize it was only 6 years old, but you know, in the early to mid 80s, car development happened fast. So I had a manual choke on that thing.
Really?
And
wow.
We replaced it with a 2-year-old Plymouth Colt, which was actually a Mitsubishi.
Right.
And it had, it didn't have the manual choke. And both were manual cars, though. I learned on stick. I enjoy cars and racing, and I don't race myself, but I enjoy watching. And
all within legal speed limits.
But I mean, I enjoy like Formula One and stuff. And for ages, I used to reflect on why is it that I like it. Is this too worldly? And I thought, I just like it, for whatever the reasons, and I can articulate some. Others, it's just, I don't know. It's fun to watch. It's cool,
So if you didn't do the job you're doing, would it be race car? Or was that what
No, I don't know. No,
Have you asked yourself that question? If you didn't do what you're doing, what would you do?
Yeah, if I didn't do what I was doing, actually, I do know exactly what I'd like to do. In fact, I talked with my wife about it this morning. I would love to be able to be a fiction writer. I love classical detective fiction like Dorothy L. Sayers. I still think she's, she's the unlisted inkling, and I think she was the greatest theologian of the bunch. But her mysteries were brilliant. So were Chesterton's, but mostly because of the dialogue but I've never yet written any fiction. But if I could, if I could swap my talent, we'll see whether I've got the talent or not.
Right. If you'd give me a random number between 100 and 150. Give me a number between
132.
132. Okay. I happen to have with me here
the
Rabbinic Targum of Lamentations. So if you turn to page 132.
I don't know if it got that far. I don't know if I wrote all the way
I always sometimes I've given the wrong. Oh yes, we're in
first
paragraph or any paragraph. Just read that aloud.
Actually, this works pretty well. This is a conclusion to chapter 3.
Excellent.
Finally, the conclusion of the book of Lamentations is anxious and uncertain in its outlook for the future. Lamentations 5:19 affirms that the Lord is sovereign and that his throne endures forever, while verse 20 asks, why have you forgotten us completely? We find in these verses elements common to the communal lament, yet it is disjointed. Quote, the survivors have not forgotten to praise God. When they do offer praise, however, a note of bitterness intrudes. And that is, who am I quoting? Westermann. Yes, I'm quoting Westermann there.
That was very readable, very listenable too for an academic book, so that's good news, right?
Well, I will tell you. So this was published in Brill, and apparently one of the criticisms was that I did not use enough technical language.
Wow.
So readability is something I do pride myself on, actually. Going before fall.
Do you know Helen Sword, Stylish Academic Writing?
No, I don't.
Oh, she's going to change your life.
It's a very ugly cover.
Yeah. Why don't you tell me the thesis of this overall?
So, like many doctoral theses, it is what my advisor gave me. Philip Alexander was my advisor. He had been working.
I didn't realize that. Okay,
he had been working on Lamentations, Targum Lamentations, for a number of years already, and what my doctorate was, and I'm still working to get it in the ebook format to get it out there. The fonts make it difficult, but it was basically a verse-by-verse commentary. Really heavily detailed on the Targum itself. Targum being Aramaic versions of the biblical text. So these are rabbinic period. In fact, of the Megillot, they're probably 6th to 8th century CE, AD. And so my shtick is to look not so much at the linguistic or manuscript issues, but rather to see, okay, what's the material that's added? So Targum is sui generis. It offers a word-for-word rendering of the Hebrew in order, but then it adds into the flow its own rendering. And so actually I'll give an example, and you feel free to add or delete.
So it's almost kind of a reductio in Geschichte in gospel studies of sorts. Well,
that's what I'm doing.
The text to the
So the Targum itself, for example, the biblical book of Lamentations began Echa Yashva V'dat Ha'ir Rabat Yam. How lonely sits the city which once was full of people. She who was a princess among the nations has become its vassal. The Targum, however, begins. Jeremiah, the prophet and high priest, told how it was decreed that Jerusalem and her people should be punished with banishment, and that they should be mourned with echa, how, the first word of the book of Lamentations. Just as when Adam and Eve were punished and expelled from the Garden of Eden, and the Master of the universe mourned them with echa, which is a play on Genesis, ayecha, where are you? The attribute of justice spoke and said, because of the greatness of her rebellious sin that was within her, thus she will dwell alone, and as a man plagued with leprosy upon his skin who sits alone. And the city which was full of crowds and many peoples has been emptied of them, and she has become like a widow. She who was great among the nations and a ruler over provinces, which had brought her tribute, has become lowly again and gives head tax to them from thereafter.
So quite an expansion.
Huge expansion. So my thesis is relatively simple, which is, what are the additions and the transformations, and how does that change the reading of the Book of Lamentations? This particular publication is pulled out the analysis and did further analysis that I didn't have time for in the doctorate. And so there's not as much verse by verse. Well, there's no verse by verse commentary in here, but as I dealt with particular passages, I worked on them.
So if you got you would do an ebook of the original, and then you have more.
So the PDF is available. Anybody can targuman.org. You're welcome to download it from there. The almost 2 years ago now, my second book on Targum Ruth came out.
I was going to ask you about that.
So, and that one I did provide more of the verse by verse commentary. It's a similar sort of approach. One of the things, when I started into this area, there were several senior scholars who were Jewish who challenged whether or not I should go into rabbinic literature and exegesis, saying that you're not a yeshiva bocher, is to quote someone. The advice, and I should quickly add that two senior colleagues, Seth Schwartz and Moshe Bernstein, have on the other hand been incredibly supportive. And basically saying, look, be who you are. So the irony is most non-Jews working in rabbinic literature tend to focus on linguistic issues and manuscript traditions and so forth. I'm not that talented in it, and I'm not that interested in it.
You like literature more.
I like literature and I like theology. And this is part of the reason I think Moshe Bernstein in particular appreciates and likes my work, or so he's told me, is because I actually care what the texts are saying.
Totally.
And I'm sympathetic to that reading. And in fact, one of my most amusing reviews of my book, The Rabbinic Targum of Lamentations, I conclude in the book that, and I'll just go ahead and read the conclusion if I can find it. So what, if any, relevance does this study have for today? Several scholars have written recently about how and why readings of Lamentations, such as found in the Targum, are untenable in a post-Holocaust world. Targum Lamentations is accepted since it is a product of a time long past, and it would be comfortable to leave it as a theological relic. Yet I have no doubt that the destructions of 586 BCE and 70 CE were every bit as devastating to those communities as the atrocities of the Second World War are to us today. We may not as individuals be persuaded by Targum Lamentations' interpretation of events, but it would be wrong of us to negate them even when applied to modern crises. For those who accept God as a guiding and determining force in history, there is in fact little other interpretation available. If nothing else, Targum Lamentations affirms and reminds us that there are consequences of our actions. There will be suffering in this world. The Targumist asks his congregation if they will suffer for their disobedience or for the sake of the name of the Lord. And a reviewer criticized my conclusion, misreading that, in saying in fact that it's untenable in a post-Holocaust world, and my point was, for you, yeah, sure, I can understand that, but if one says God maintains and directs every jot and tittle of history, then there's not many other options out there.
Right.
And so the Targumist is trying to address that and work within that theological framework.
Like, what are you working on now?
Well, I just finished a chapter for Chris Keith's project on 3-volume series on reception of Jesus in the first 3 centuries. And I'll be speaking today at the seminary about Jesus in the Talmud. But right now, my biggest project is actually something more for the clergy and the laity, more pastoral in nature. I'm calling it Beautiful and Terrible Things, a biblical theology of suffering and grace.
Okay.
Our son, Mack, as you know, died very unexpectedly New Year's Eve 2012 of a blood infection. It looked like the flu, turned out to be sepsis, and within 36 hours, Mack was gone. And owing not least to this project on Lamentations, I was about as theologically prepared as anybody could be.
Well, I actually, that thought crossed my mind.
So, immediately sort of bring that to bear, having been trained, informed as a priest, going through clinical pastoral education in hospitals. And people were amazing. The community, the Penn State community, the soccer community came around us, and of course the faith community. So this is a work, and I've gone back and forth. The first sort of draft of it was very mechanical, and just sort of working my way through Scripture. And I found that actually, a handful of us will appreciate it, but it doesn't meet people where they live.
Right.
And so that's really what I'm trying to work on. And
so from that work, you kind of distill down.
Yeah, what I've done is I've reframed them as essays, and taking, there's still certain amounts of organization to it that you might expect. I think it's really important that we start with a good, solid understanding of Genesis 1 through 3, the creation narrative, and what it's telling us theologically, which is we do live in a fallen and a broken world. It shouldn't surprise us when what I call unmerited suffering occurs, where there's no clear correlation with sin or punishment or guidance or correction or direction either. Right. Just that it's because we live in a sinful world. Our son didn't sin. I mean, yes, he was not perfect, but there's nothing he did to deserve his death. We didn't do anything to bring his death on. Right. And I don't think God took him to lead us to something else. I wouldn't say that God took Mack so that my wife would write her collection of essays, which have been very influential and comforting for people. Sure. Nor the things that I've written, some of which have been encouraging to people, but rather it's then how we respond to those events is what I think is going on. So I think we begin in that understanding of Genesis 1, that this is what happens to us. And then we work our way through it. And so when I come back to the pastoral question, I have found, in listening to others struggling, particularly where they're in churches that are saying, it's God's will, you need to accept that and move on. Never share that phrase with someone who is grieving. Moving on is, you always carry that with you. We do grow. But that language of just, it's God's will, accepted, that is not comforting. Even if one does believe absolutely theologically every jot and tittle God manages in our lives, that's not comforting. Right. And so I think what we can find instead is the promises of God's grace, that He will be with us as we walk through this life and these journeys, that He will be present, He will place people who are present with us. He allows us to make our own choices, which is why so many of us are miserable, why so many folks do struggle to overcome grief. But we're in a broken world that it not only includes blood infections and cancer, but mental health issues and environmental concerns that can bring that kind of hardship into our lives. So,
have you thank you for sharing all that really personally and also theologically. No, it's great. It's good. Eleanor Stump, Christian philosopher at St. Louis University, her book Wandering in Darkness.
So I haven't. No, I haven't.
I think you would find a lot of life there. She is an analytic philosopher. I'm more on the continental side myself, but she is this brilliant analytic philosopher who addresses the problem of evil and the problem of suffering in particular, and says, philosophy and an analytic approach is not sufficient to deal with the problem of suffering in our lives. We need narrative.
Right, exactly.
We need a more complex. And so she goes through the biblical stories. It's a big, long book, and does this sort of brilliant exposition of...
Wait, what's the name?
It's called Wandering in Darkness. I think you'd really enjoy it. And one of the cool things what Stump does, I mean, she's just brilliant and a very good writer and everything, but she starts with a taxonomy she makes up, which is what philosophers do best. You know, they create taxonomies. Right. And she calls it the Franciscan versus the Dominican way of knowing. And so she uses St. Francis and Dominic.
I may have read some of this because this is a very, very familiar.
They're both, it's quite good because she's saying, you know, both of these epistemological ways are good and helpful. Like to know logically and to know by deduction is the Dominican way, and that's good. Yep. But it's not sufficient. You also need a Franciscan way of knowing, which is an experiential and narratival way of knowing. And so that's the taxonomy she lays out. It's really good.
That's very much where I'm coming from too, about lots of things. And I share with people about the loss of our son, not because I want sympathy, I'm always grateful for it, but because it's an important part of my life. If you want to know anything about me, you have to know that. It has shaped and formed me. You know, one of the reasons why Elizabeth and I, and Izzy, our daughter too, we've been so fervent about creating a foundation to remember Mack and making that around the goalkeepers at Penn State something positive and fun and gritty, was because we wanted people, when they remember Mack, not to remember the parents who collapsed when their child passed away, but rather to remember the boy who loved goalkeeping, wanted to play for Penn State in the national team as a goalkeeper. Right. You know, and I think that's analogous with all these aspects of our lives. When we hit hardship, when we hit difficult times, you know, we should not forget those. I don't believe that God has necessarily sent them to us, but I know God is present with us as we walk from that moment. I mean, Epictetus, which I frankly only learned in the last few years, Epictetus the philosopher, Stoic philosopher, who basically said the same thing, which is we can't control what happens to us in our lives, but we can control our reactions to them. Mm-hmm. And I think that one of the great promises of grace in Scripture is that not only has God given us that agency, that opportunity, that will to make those choices and decisions, but He has also said we don't make them alone. And even when we make the bad or wrong choices and decisions, or the not best ones, He's still present with us. Well, the title of the book is Beautiful and Terrible Things, and it actually comes from a Frederick Buechner quote. Here is the world. Beautiful and terrible things will happen. Don't be afraid. And I liked it. I used it a few times, you know, sending out of students to say, this is what the world is like. So be ready, but also be excited. Yes, it's going to be hard. Terrible things will happen, but beautiful things too. Don't be afraid. And I thought, well, if I'm going to use it for the title, I need to go find it in situ. Scholar, you got to find the quote. Well, the only place I found it is in one of his alphabeticeteries, ABCs, under G for grace. And I'm not going to remember the full quote, but he says something like, God's grace is something like this. God is saying to you, the party is here, and it would not be complete without you, so I have made you. Here is the world. Beautiful and terrible things will happen. Don't be afraid, for I will always be with you.
So it kind of de-theologized it in all the graduation speeches.
Well, exactly.
Right?
So two things that occurred to me. One is I wonder how many people who've used that in graduation speeches really know the fuller context. Right. And the two, and I've written the introduction to my book already, and it's on the blog, targumman.org. Right. You're never supposed to do that till the end, but what I did is I wrote a little piece about it, and I said, basically, go meditate on this for about 3 months, and you've got the biblical theology of suffering and grace.
If you reach down there into there are some envelopes, and you can choose any color you want.
All right.
And these are random questions. I don't know what all's in there either, and you'll give an answer. And then I'll commit to answering the same question as well.
All right. So we're going to go with blue. It's not quite a Kentucky blue, more of a Penn State blue, but that'll work. What happens if I get car sick and throw up all over you?
Well, we'll have a great video of it.
Would be great. I'll try and do it right into the camera. Are you an organ donor? Why or why not? I am an organ donor.
Okay.
And I am because of the lives it will save. Our son, we were unable to donate his organs because of the blood infection. But I have known so many people who have lived because of it. And how about you?
Yes, I have to admit that I'm 90% sure I am. I'm pretty sure there's no reason why I wouldn't have at the time, and so I'm pretty sure I
and I can see, I mean, there are, of course, some theological and ethical questions about that and genetic research and organ harvesting, which I understand, but I do think that it's appropriate. I did have one of our directors of philanthropy, a fundraiser in our college. She was with us a year, devout Roman Catholic and a devout animal lover, and she would make the sign of the cross every time we passed roadkill. And when we drove in the South, it was so frequent, I said, look, let me make the sign of the cross for you so you can keep both hands on the steering wheel while we're driving, because but I was appreciative of her devotion.
Well, it's been great. I'm ready to eat some barbecue.
Thank you very much. Oh, I'm starving.
How about you? All right, thanks for holding off on the barbecue. And,
I can't wait. My favorite.
Hey, thanks so much for watching. 3 really quick things. If you like this video, subscribe to our YouTube channel and connect with us on social media. We'd really appreciate it. Secondly, check out the comments section below. We've put a bunch of program notes and links to interesting things there. And third, check out some of our episodes you can see linked here. Thanks. We'll see you on the road. Peace.